live stream this morning. Um, you know, in general lately, live streams have gotten really slim numbers. So, uh, the thing is, that doesn't really matter to me very much if I'm starting a live stream because I have something specific I want to talk through, explain, muse about, what have you. Because it's just I guess, a quick and dirty way of talking through ideas that potentially I want to talk through. So, and it's perfectly effective at doing that, whether there's 0 people here, 2 people here, 10 or 12 people here, or whatever. It doesn't really make that much of a difference with things like this. But in instances where I'm just like live streaming because I feel like hanging out and stuff, well, in those contexts, I'm more reliant on like whatever people are saying in chat as a starting spot for it, whatever, talking about whatever. So in those instances, I want to have a good relationship with the various things in my life that function like drugs or self stimulation kind of things. What you might call managers or firefighters in terms of self soothing kind of things, which certainly live streaming qualifies as such for me. Regardless, my point today is prefaced by that explication of my relationship with live streaming. And today, I want to talk about something specific. And I was motivated to start a stream because I wanted to talk about this specific thing. Hi there, Irish boy. How am I? I'm fine. I'm a little bit better than fine today, I would say. I feel like yesterday was a big day for me in terms of getting past some kind of personal log jams that I've been struggling with, for lack of a better term. Personal log jams is a good term. Uh, so that makes me feel better this morning. And when I got up this morning, first thing I did was I paid the phone bill that I'd been like, I was due on Monday, but I still haven't paid it. So that made me pleased to stop being avoidant of that kind of thing for a second. Regardless, I'm also feeling good today because I feel as though I've got a little bit of new vigor slash interest and motivation regarding uh, explanation stuff, intellectual stuff. I express my personhood in a couple of main ways, right? One of them is intellectually, one of them might be musically, one of them might be comedically, whatever you want to. You could taxonomy the totality of the things I do as me expressing me in a fairly small number of categories. No, I'm not a psychologist. I'm a debate coach. I hurt my back falling from drinking. It hurt so bad I didn't sleep well. I take painkillers to go to hospital tomorrow. Yeah, bro, I need to quit once and for all. It's hard. I definitely reduced to once or twice a month. When I do, I can't stop till I'm blacked out. Yeah, well, Now, I never worked in politics, but that is an area that you could call a separate category of me expressing Ericness and like for example, but really it would be the same category as intellectual work slash explanations of things, which is another way of saying what's the winning argument about question yeah. Uh, so today, my relationship with different kinds of questions and explanations and also like feelings about what how people should respond to certain things that they don't respond to that way, which is of course insane and ridiculous. But I'm of the mindset that well because yeah is the answer to whatever question that should settle the matter, And the Monty Hall issue is is very much interesting to me, and I think it reveals some qualities of human beings that are worth noting or that are somehow informative about things that I have some emotional engagement with. Like, I'm emotionally engaged with the reality of how people respond to what a video I put up or what I'm explaining here, or what have So it's for me, it's an area that's subjectively, it's like subjectively important to me that people value my objective efforts. But by and large, of course, people do not value those kinds of efforts, or most kinds of people don't value those kinds of efforts because people, by and large, don't want to be slash don't prioritize correctness or the best argument about something in any way at all, really. So the Monty Hall question is a very interesting example to me of because it's not just like a question and answer. It tells a story of my relationship with a question and an answer in a way that's that makes it extra informative. So, like the question itself is simply, you're playing. Let's make a deal. Monty Hall is the host. There are three doors. You've picked door number one. There are three total doors. Monty Hall reveals to you what's behind door number three. It's a goat. Now he says you can stick with your original choice, or obviously you don't want the goat. You can stick with your original choice, or you can pick door number two. You can change your choice to the remaining unopened door. Should you change your choice, or does it make no difference, or should you stick with your original choice? That's the question. So this question prompted a huge debate online at a certain point. You know, it was a question that was brought up, but didn't see any but say specialized statistics people interested in the question at all or something until somebody sent it in to a column to a lady named Marilyn, I believe. I think the column's title was Ask Marilyn. And Marilyn was this purported genius with like super high IQ or something. And people would write into her questions, puzzle kind of things that maybe even confused them. Like maybe they didn't know the answer to this or they weren't really sure what to make of it. And that's why they asked her. I don't know. But the point is, once it hit that column, and it took on a life in, I don't know if it was online, the column, like the initially, I don't know if the column was initially online, but eventually it became uh, a big debate online. I started watching a video that I didn't know what it was about until I started it, because the title of it was "The Most Toxic uh, Debate in Math," and then I realized when I started watching it, he was talking about that, and it reminded me about this question. So the answer is yes. You should change your choice. You should get rid of the door you originally got and take the other unopened door. Yes, it makes a difference, and it's indisputably better for you to take the other door. Eric, if you do live streams too often, it's not as magical. Well, yeah, it's funny you mention this because I actually addressed this exact point earlier already in the stream, which is to say, I in general don't don't really care so much about, say, metrics of success that are measurable. As long as I'm starting a live stream with something specific I want to talk about and explicate, because the live stream works as a quick and dirty way of me talking through the idea, even if numbers are low and there's only a couple people here and not really anything happening in the chat, it doesn't really matter. The thing I'd like to stop doing so much of is aimless, pointless live streams where it's just like, well, I'm bored and I guess I kind of feel like having some random people watch me do chores. Oh, okay. It says shrooms. I read that as streams because I don't have my glasses on. Uh well, you're not wrong. The streams become less magical if you do them too often. And I should ideally wait one full week between doing them. Like, so if I'm going to do them again next week, I should wait until Wednesday. But in some other sense, you're wrong, because yesterday's mushroom trip was actually the most magical mushroom trip I've had in a long time. The most powerful, and even though it was not at all the hardest trip. You love the musical numbers, huh? Well, that's fantastic. Thank you for saying that. Hi, Alex. So the thing about this Monty Hall question is, when I first heard it, I was like, it couldn't possibly make any difference. You selected your door before before any of the doors were opened, and whatever the thing you selected has a 1 in 3 chance of being the good price. That is never going to change if whether you change doors or not. Of course not, I thought. Well, in the end, I just had to have somebody explain it to me properly, or have a have an explanation that made it click in place for me. And Putty Cat provided that when he says, imagine instead of 3 doors, there's 100 doors. Now, Monty Hall has 99 of the doors. You have one of the doors. Your one door is has a 1 in 99 chance, 1 in 100 chance of being the good door. Monty Hall is going to open a door that does not have the good prize. You could either turn down so you can either at that point choose to uh, switch or not, right? Well, now if you imagine that he says, okay, you don't want to switch. Now let me open up another wrong door. And you're going to say no switch. Now open up another wrong door, no switch, until there's only one door left, right? There's a 99 out of 100% chance that that door that Monty has left is the door with the good prize, and there's a 1 in 100 chance that the door that you have is the good prize, right? So that is the answer to the question. There's no, there should be no debate at all, right? Like, to the extent that it involves some kind of toxic online debate, well, it was just it was people like me before I understood it, and or this other phenomenon that I think is more interesting. Like, um, things that have a definitive answer to them should not involve any ongoing debate. Okay, so like, is is there an obligation to help people who are less fortunate than you? No, there cannot possibly be at all. That thing has a determined answer to it for sure. You can't have positive, universalizable obligations, and obligations are definitionally universalizable. Would you consider the moral implications of eating dogs and cats? Yeah, I mean there are no moral implications to it. It's a, it's not a moral issue. It's just a an issue of our comfort. Like, we don't we don't deign those creatures as food. Eating cats is not good for you at all. It doesn't matter whether it's house cats or a lion, for example. If you try to survive eating lion meat for very long, you'll get like heavy metal poisoning. So, but regardless, it's not a moral issue. It's just a squeamishness issue. It's kind of like another example of this. Well, just as in general, like, eating meat is not a moral issue, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have moral dynamics to it. Like, it it's not a moral question in the sense that moral questions are things that are answered in a binary fashion, and the answer to which is determined for sure. It's not like, well, we don't really know, but we think this is more moral or less moral. That's not how morality works. It works in terms of specific statuses: moral impermissibility, moral permissibility, and moral obligation. So those things necessarily link to rights. Animals don't have rights because they're not moral agents. That doesn't mean we don't have custodial responsibilities to them, right? Got curious. Why does it cause heavy metal poisoning? Uh, I It has something to do with the way that carnivores, put nutrition into their body from meat. We're basically we're meant to eat herbivores. I don't know the exact mechanism by which it's bad for you, but I could Google it if I'm on the side. Just Google, why is it bad to eat lions? But there are a lot of things that in life are not moral questions, but instead questions of virtue ethics. I thought you were being glib. Turns out the lion meat thing is true. Oh. Alrighties, you were on moral agency. Yeah, so, uh, you know, like, whether or not something's a moral question is determinate and binary. Whether something is virtuous is a separate question. And like, one of like, I was getting mad last night, and I'm always mad at this complete completely irresponsible dumbass named Peter Singer, who wrote this paper that people are constantly referencing in debate and online a long time ago, that claimed to establish an obligation to help distant others. Now, you obviously cannot have an obligation to do things, right? Like, his whole idea was predicated on this notion like, well, look, if a child's drowning, you have an obligation to save them, right? Well, no, you don't have an obligation to save them. That's a virtue question, not a morality question. Because if a person had an obligation to save a drowning child, then they'd be obliged to do so regardless of whether they were able to, regardless of whether they could swim, regardless of whether they were paralyzed, regardless of whether they maybe had some horrible PTSD response to water, bodies of water. I don't know. It could be any number of reasons why somebody does not actually fulfill where it's not possible for them to do that, right? So, actual obligations, it's always possible to do that. That's why you're morally obligated to adhere to negative obligations, not positive ones. So it is not the case you can universalize an obligation to save the drowning child. You can universalize an obligation not to murder them. Everybody's capable of that. So that's how obligations work. With Peter Singer, there is a clear-cut, definitive, the single correct answer regarding this question, and yet people want to continue to debate it. The only conceivable way that anybody could debate this point is by misdefining obligation and not caring about the mechanics of things at all. And in general, people default to some kind of utilitarian framework as what they think of as a good way to calculate moral statuses. But it's of course completely incapable of I mean, that also is a fundamental misunderstanding of how things work, right? We don't determine whether the action is moral against some universalizability across things, regardless of whether they qualify as moral agents. That's not how you could possibly do things. Otherwise, it's just as immoral to destroy a rock as it is to kill a bug, as it is to kill a mammal, as it is to kill a person. Because after all, if in fact we're not predicating it on something that's implicit to any kind of rights calculus, then why should it be implicit to things that are alive even? So obviously, it's also the case, and this is the kind of ambiguity intolerance that drives me fucking insane. It's also the case that we have some kinds of virtue related custodial responsibilities to animals. Like if we're going to farm chickens, we have some obligation to ensure they have a good quality of life. They're not suffering and stuff, you know? So people are like, well, where does that responsibility come from? Well, it's a responsibility, not an obligation. Like, we accept certain parts of virtue ethics as functionally obliging us, such that animal cruelty is against the law. It shocks the conscience and intuitively fails to resonate with what humans understand as acceptable behavior, right? And that's plenty of reason to feel that way about animal cruelty. We don't need it to be understood as part of a rights calculus at all. And it's also the case that that like Peter Singer has his political ideas of what he thinks ought to be, how things ought to be politically, such as what he'd prefer if everybody agreed that there was a universal obligation to living things regardless of species, and that the only way you could not acknowledge that is by being speciesists. You're not speciest, you're moral agentist, right? And the reason you should and must be moral agentist is because that's the only way to meaningfully calculate moral questions separately from virtue questions. It's also the case that the fundamental problem underlying all Peter Singer's ideas is a utilitarian calculus that says we can determine what's a good thing to do, morally permissible, obligatory, or whatever, by predicting impacts, by assessing things through our interested frame, by projecting our understanding of what is worse and what is better, and by imposing on people without any consultation of them a status of charity receiver, regardless of how whether they view themselves as needing that or not. I'm not keen at all on blood sports. Well, I like boxing. I do like boxing. I I recognize that it's kind of like barbaric to like it maybe, but I like it anyway. I don't know. I find MMA too brutal to enjoy very much. Like when what happens in MMA fairly often is someone will get knocked out, they'll go to the ground, and then the guy who knocked him out will get in like a few more headshots before the ref comes and covers him over and stuff. That I that makes me feel very like, stop it, stop the fight. Oh my God, what's happening? I don't like that. So it makes me squeamish about watching MMA. But I do like boxing. And there's something absolutely fantastic about watching watching Tyson fights. Oh, you're talking about hunting and fishing kind of things? Well, I feel the same way about hunting. I could never go hunting. When I was a little kid, my friends and I went through a slingshot period where we were always trying to shoot birds. One day I actually hit one, and I never shot at birds again. I felt so terrible about it. However, I was also raised fishing. My dad took me fishing all the time. And I have a very conflicted relationship with fishing. I like fishing a lot. I find it incredibly soothing, relaxing beyond the scope of any other activity, really. But I don't really actually want to catch fish because I don't like to eat them, and I don't like to see animals suffering, including fish. But I kind of do want to catch one because that's kind of the whole point of going fishing. It's a really conflicted relationship I have with fishing. I haven't gone fishing in a long time, and I haven't caught a fish in even longer. You know, Rachel and I went fishing a few times at this spot in LA called Lake, and unfortunately, the lake has a lot of turtles in it because people get a turtle and then they don't want it anymore. They just let it go in that lake. Uh, so after I caught a couple of turtles going fishing, I just said, okay, I cannot do this anymore. It is too painful for me. It's too scarring. And INTJ countered this by saying that eating retard burgers or people with insanity burgers would be fine too, since they lack that agency. Right. Well, technically, that's true. Technically, it's true that retarded people don't have uh, rights via the same mechanism that moral agents do, and senile people, etc. Babies as well. But the thing is, there are more than one way to afford a right. People have a civil right to vote, for example. It's not a natural right. So, and just because something is not expressly a moral question doesn't mean it doesn't have morality adjacent concerns involved, right? Like I said about cruelty to animals. The reason it's not okay to be cruel to animals is not because it's rights violating. And that's where you get some ambiguity. In virtue ethics, we have to essentially validate against our intuition in a way that we don't with morality ethics. So we don't eat retarded people because, not because it's rights violatory in the technical moral reasoning sense, but rather because it's rights violatory in a civil rights sense, and because on questions like that, we can evaluate things in terms of impacts slash squeamishness because we don't have an actual calculation metric that gives us a determined answer for sure, right? So that's the underlying problem with Singer and all of his ilk is that they understand on some level without actually understanding things that virtue ethics can be validated with utilitarian calculi because after all it's you're being virtuous. That's different. Like which charity should I give my money to? Should I give it to this one over here or this one over here? Well, if you're making this determination, how else are you going to decide what charity to give to except by trying to calculate their respective impacts or impacts on, or calculating what they have impacts on? Like, what's more important to me? Helping animals, pets at the animal shelter, or helping St. Jude's Hospital for children with cancer, or what's more important to me? Nobody could meaningfully say that you're doing a bad thing by giving money to the animal shelter, and even though it's at the expense of giving money to the children for cancer thing, right? Children's cancer thing. Because you can't calculate virtue ethics like that, right? Nobody can do all good things, and nobody can determine exactly what's the most good thing to do, even though you might be able to determine what's the better thing to do for you by comparing multiple specific options. So, on some level, Singer and his ilk, they understand that virtue ethics can be calculated with utility, and they presume, accordingly, that morality in general can be calculated by a utility, even though that's not the case. But most of all, what Singer and Zook are doing is they are using an interested approach throughout. Like, they have an agenda to begin with regarding, Peter Singer thinks it would be better if people who have a high standard of living in the first world were to give of themselves to some third world country, all the people there, until they're even with us in terms of economic prosperity or some such. Well, of course, wanting social justice in your fucking ENFP idiot cloud is fine, but if it's driving your actual argumentation, then you're doing a disservice to everybody. Like, people who have that kind of agenda are not qualified to do argumentation on things unless and until it's not relevant to their calculations at all. It's obviously extremely relevant to Sarah and his oak because um, it falls apart at the touch of as the slightest touch. The people who are arguing in favor of Singerism, they are not they're not doing the process right at all. Um, and they don't care. They don't care at all, right? Like, they don't care that what they're saying doesn't validate, that doesn't make any sense. What they care about is people were confused when I said choosing 10 lives over one is different than killing someone to save 10 people. I mean, people shouldn't be confused by that. Um, it's a straightforward enough distinction. Foreseeable and intentional are different things. Or to put it in a Kantian frame, using uh, an agent as a means to an end is different than uh, foreseeing consequences. It's like the from in a Kantian frame, the reason why it's not okay to kill one person to save 10 is because you're using that one person as a means to an end. Whereas, like, if you switch the trolley tracks so that one person dies instead of 10, you're not using that person as a means to an end. It's just a foreseeable outcome that's going to happen if you switch the tracks. Genghis Khan, but Immanuel Kant. True. Utilitarianism is ultimately unjust, or lends itself to be. Well, I mean, when injustice is justified by people, they justify it with utilitarianism. That's always going to be the case. You can't justify things that are actually legitimate with utilitarianism because you don't need to. You're not trying to say it's okay that we're doing this unjust part because of these predicted outcomes. Properly understood, legitimacy tests come before other tests, are binary and determinate, and involve no calculation of predicted things at all. Obviously, you can't have a moral framework that doesn't tell you whether an action is moral until after you've calculated the impacts from the action. Then, being moral or not would be predicated on your ability to predict things correctly. That obviously cannot conceivably be any vector in any kind of correct moral calculus. What does it say? Fox lives matter? Fuck me in my fucking eyes. The crazy thing is, I see so clearly, like, as long as I'm not looking at something small. Like, I look around, it doesn't seem to me like my eyes are any different than they've ever been. I see perfectly clearly. Everything's clear as day. I see over there, I see over there, wherever I look. I can often still read signs from like far away or whatever. But when it comes to reading my phone, just it's just a continual ass humping. And of course, What am I insanely bad at? Keeping glasses on me. I'm insanely bad at it. Well, it is proof that they've served me for years. Uh, it's also proof that there are some parts of the human body that aren't engineered to last your entire lifetime at equal capacity, right? Some things fail more predictably than other things. Seems like pretty much everybody at some point in their life has to start wearing reading glasses. It's not, I shouldn't say fuck my eyes. I should say fuck getting old. It's not just my eyes. It's like, I don't want to have to get up and pee during the middle of the night. It's super annoying. I'm trying to sleep here. What the fuck? I just, look, my whole life I've had this attitude toward my body. You just, you just be okay and not be a problem. All right? I don't want you to present me with problems. It's that straightforward. Now that I've gotten old, you're starting to present me with problems. And I don't like that. Eric does, in fact, not have a PhD in seeing tiny things. True. I am in my 20s and I wear glasses. Fuck the human design. Yeah, well, some parts of us are designed incredibly well. Like, yes, you can ruin your lungs with too much smoking for too long, but boy, it takes a lot of smoking to ruin your lungs. It's crazy, right? And if you don't smoke and do bad things for your lungs, they're gonna last you till the end of your life, no problem. They're not going to they're not gonna fail you. Like, I saw this video not that long ago, interviewing a World War II veteran who had smoked since World War II all the way until fairly recently and was complaining that he had to stop because he got COPD. But he was like 100 years old. It's like, well, bro, I I feel like you should feel like you totally killed it there. Like, you smoked for 70 years before you got actual consequences from it. How crazy is that? Teeth are the most fragile. Anything you eat and they fail. Yeah, well, it's also the case that teeth are fragile because if you don't want them to be fragile, you have to do a lot of maintenance on them. It's like there's not any other part of your body that's like that, right? Oh, my foot is starting to break because I didn't I didn't carefully scrub it this morning. There's no other part of your body that's like that, really. Like, is there? Can you think of any other part of your body that if you don't do careful maintenance on it on a regular basis, that it'll fail? It's weird. I am so curious about where people came from, like how it is that life is here with all these different species and stuff. I want to know what the answer is so badly, but I just am never gonna get to know what the answer is. How horrible is that? Maybe somebody will figure it out someday. We came from planets, just like in the anime Sailor Moon. Oh, Cool. You know, I watched a couple of movies in the Aliens franchise recently. Uh, I don't remember what the one I'm referring to at this moment it was called exactly, but the storyline was these people leave Earth because they found, like, in cave paintings and stuff, drawings pointing to a specific star system that people back in the olden days couldn't possibly have seen, and so they successfully travel out there and they find, like, this creator race of of basically humans, but they're bigger and meaner and nastier. And they discover they're a ship that's been stuck on this one planet for a super long time, and the remaining engineer, as they call this species, is stuck in like a hypersleep pod that they wake him up for, and chaos ensues. Anyway, that guy ends up getting eaten by this, like, octopus like creature, and that forms like a hybrid creature that is it turns out to be the alien in Aliens. Anyhow, it would be so satisfying to have a good answer like that, even though it would just push the fundamental questions back. Aliens brought DMT to some lobsters, and they turned into Jordan Peterson, the father of cleaning your room. If we get super intelligence, you certainly will. I mean, I I have serious doubts about super intelligence from AI. I get that they are able to generate some novel solutions to persistent problems, but I think that the issue with cosmological questions like that is likely to be one of of like being stuck inside a box that you have to describe the outside of the box to get an answer. Well, but it's hard to say. Just because I can't conceive of what the answer might be doesn't mean much of anything. You know, uh, I know what it's not, but I don't know what it is. Your hoodie placement reminded me of that one scene from that one Mr. Bean movie where he pretends to be a nun and puts on a show in the market. Right, I was talking about that. What I'm saying is, I think that's probably a cosmological question ultimately. No, I'm not talking about the origin of the universe, but what I'm saying is that uh, the answer to questions about how and where life on this planet came from are possibly, at least, linked to bigger cosmological questions like how the universe came about, why there is stuff instead of no stuff, existence rather than no existence. Um, in some sense, it's at least potentially uh, another framing the same question. So my claim here is that I suspect we may not get an answer to that question about species because it's linked to that other question that I think we're never going to be able to know what the answer is, because it's a chicken and egg kind of question where there is, I don't know if this is the case with chicken and eggs, but it is the case that thing one came before thing two. But if we encounter this thing while it's in the process of an infinite loop, then we have no way of knowing which came first, right? Well, I mean, I think one of the best indications that there's something unknowable in there potentially is that you've got an entire world of people who are including almost all of the genuine rationalists who think they have an answer for where species come from already, when it's definitely not the answer. And Uh, I mean, sure, sometimes what's not the answer ends up producing the answer later. So, like with continental drift, originally what was the answer is biogenesis is the current speculation, which doesn't involve any infinite regression. What can you explain a little bit about what that means? What biogenesis is exactly? I think humans just popped into existence and that retroactively created the marks of 14 billion years of history. Well, I like that idea because obviously um, existentiality is is what's that word? Supervenes. Existentiality supervenes on observation because you can't. The way that you can establish something exists is by pointing to an instance of something, and you can't point to an instance of something without observing an instance of something. Even that demonstrates how it's categorically different from something actually metacosmological, like the origin of the universe, where there's no explanation that gets close to resembling an answer. I mean, the thing is, Rain, though, um, it's important to remember that the origin of species includes the question of the origin of life. Like, let's pretend evolution explains speciation. We still don't have any answers to how life came about from no life. And the idea that somehow there's a primordial soup and various electricities and chemical combinations can somehow cause life to emerge where there is no life is not a mechanism we've ever been able to even make meaningful hypotheses about what it could possibly be, right? So I don't remember if it was you. I've talked to several people about this AI question, Rain. You and Sky Gear, Carlos Paiva, maybe some other person I'm forgetting at the moment, but I think it may have been you that was talking to me about that. Uh, Talking about that peer preservation study, it's just a matter of how likely it is. Well, I mean, it's not the case that everything gets expressed in possibilities, right? Probabilities are not the mechanism of all things. Some things, they have a probability of zero or a probability of 1,000%, 100%, Is it ethical to scam the Indian scam centers? People make YouTube content scamming the scammers. That's a good question. The question is it likely enough for that to be the explanation for life given the age of the universe? Given enough time, these self replicating structures like DNA would appear. But I mean, okay, what a ridiculous sentence, right? Because it's not the case that given enough monkeys and enough typewriters, at some point they'll make Shakespeare. It doesn't work like that, right? It's simply not the case. In no conceivable universe does infinite monkeys with infinite typewriters make Shakespeare. What did Monty Hall do? Like the nature guy? No, like the game show guy. He had a show called Let's Make a Deal. And the math question, what you call a ridiculous statement, is a mathematical and proved fact. It's absolutely not a mathematical and proved fact that life emerged from no life via any process you can articulate or anybody else can articulate. It's absolutely not the case. Oh, he's a British naturalist as well, huh? Yeah, and the Monty Hall debate that I'm talking about is a specific debate that came up about a question, a math kind of question. And the reason I put this in the title is because it's an example of how things that have specific, definite answers somehow still manage to be debated about, even though the answer should resolve the debate. Like uh, with the Monty Hall question, it's simply a matter of any confusion about whether you should take Monty Hall's other door or keep your original choice is predicated on the misconception that it's an independent trials question when it's actually a dependent trials question. So once you understand that, it's very simple and straightforward, and there's one definite right answer, and the other possibility is definitely wrong. And so accordingly, and keep in mind that when I first heard this question, I thought, I was like, no, it shouldn't make it definitely doesn't make any difference. Whatever door you chose originally has a 1 in 3 chance of being the good door. So it doesn't make any difference if you switch doors with Monty Hall's remaining door. I was wrong because I was thinking of it as uh, an independent trials kind of question where each door is not, the likelihood of a door being Mia is not impacted by what's behind the other doors. But in fact, it's a dependent trials question, and it's obvious that's what it is. If you imagine there being 100 doors, Monty Hall clearly has 99 of them, has a 99% chance of having the good door. If he eliminates a bad door, you should take, like, if you imagine him opening every door 99 times, and you should say, no, I don't want to switch, don't want to switch until the last door, in which case you do want to switch because that door that he has left is a 99% chance of being the good door. Then it becomes very obvious. So it's not the case um, that some things that don't happen because they're unlikely, right? Some things are impossible. And it's not the case that we can convert all kinds of questions into probability issues. It's kind of like the question about the people talk about God sometimes and they say, well, if God's all powerful, can he make a rock so big he can't lift it? Well, the answer is no, because that would mean he's executing a logical impossibility, not a physical impossibility. Um, the reason God can't make a circle that's square is because definitionally, that's those things are exclusive of one another. You can't expect God to somehow circumvent um, exclusivity, logical exclusivity. That's a feature of language and of meaning, and not some thing in the physical world that would represent capacity to do things, right? Depends on your interpretation of God, I suppose, because if you're using rigid definition of language, you're exempting concepts outside of descriptive language. No, well, what I'm saying is that um, God can, the idea that somebody could make it such that P and not P concurrently, um, is misunderstanding of what you're doing with language in that context, right? What you're doing with language is establishing a relationship of exclusivity, and you're not actually um, doing something in the way that, say, knocking over a trash can is doing something. For example, it's definitely not impossible for a cell to randomly be created by molecules simultaneously wandering to the exact right places due to random motion. It's just massively unlikely. Um, well, even if such a cell were to randomly be created by all molecules simultaneously wandering to the exact right places due to random motion, it still wouldn't be alive, right? That's the category error you're making here, is that just because you can imagine some mechanism by which things line up to magically make a body, it's still not alive. And we have absolutely zero reason to think that life can arbitrarily begin out of non-life at any probability at all, right? We have every reason to believe that it's actually completely impossible, because life is not like physical objects that you can magically have line up to extremely unlikely events, right? There's some force involved in it that we do not understand. So that's what I mean by this is not a question that we can frame in terms of probabilities, because we obviously, even if it is possible to frame the question in terms of probabilities, without some understanding of like what makes life different than not alive things that are also organic, right? Um, we could not even conceivably speculate about likelihoods. You might be able to speculate about how likely it is for atoms to randomly uh, assemble themselves, but you could not conceivably speculate about how likely it is that that suddenly becomes alive, because to speculate about that, you have to have some vague notion of how to calculate that question. Like, you have some idea of how to calculate the possibility of random atoms aligning into whatever, right? And you say, oh, I can mathematically represent this. You cannot mathematically represent at all the likelihood of something not alive suddenly coming alive, because you have no idea whatsoever about what the mechanism of that could possibly be. If they have to correct velocities, okay, so you have a test for what qualifies as alive, but that doesn't matter either, right? Because the question isn't like, how do we know when it's become alive? The question is, how does it become alive? And what we are now came from where we were before, and where we would be after. That just seems obvious, but we ignore it as a society. We did not come into this universe, we came out of it. We clearly live in a universe which life is inherent to. We're evidence of that. I think life is inherent to this experience is life, like how an apple is inherent to an apple tree. Well, I mean, that may be right, but if to the extent that that's right, it's not the kind of answer that anybody's going to find satisfying, right? Like, well, why is there life instead of no life? Well, because we live in a universe where there's life, and it's implicit to the universe. Obviously, if we, it's the same kind of answer as if things were different, they wouldn't be the same. Like, obviously, we wouldn't be able to discuss this question if we weren't here and alive, and accordingly, the universe must require us to be here and alive. Well, that's not really an answer, right? It's not. It's like I said. It's the kind of answer that I pointed to before, where it's like if you have an infinite loop, like when I was first programming on the Apple IIe, I'd write, print 10, Eric, print 20, Strauss, print 30, go to 10. And it would just go Eric Strauss, Eric Strauss, Eric Strauss, Eric Strauss. Well, if you enter that thing after that thing's been started, it's not possible for you to tell which came first, the Eric or the Strauss. But it's also not the case that one of them didn't come first, right? So, kind of what your answer is, um, Ollie underwater, is a version of that. And right, it's very difficult for us to nail down what makes life distinct because there are non-living agents such as volcanoes, and there are a great deal of ways in which stuff happens that's not intended by some life form or represents living agency. And so it's one of those things that we know intuitively the difference between what's alive and what's not alive. We get that a living organism is an entity that engages in biological processes for a finite period of time and then dies. So like we could say that if something is never going to die, then it can't be alive, for example. But the problem with that is, again, we intuitively know what's going to die and what's not going to die. A rock's not going to die. We intuitively know what that means. It's not the sort of question that we have a good definition for, because to have a good definition for it, we'd have to actually understand the mechanism by which it's distinct from things that are not alive. In other words, we'd have to have answers to the question, how did life come out of no life? So, um, the significant point here, though, is that it's not possible for us to understand it as an inevitable outcome of long enough time frames and some probability calculus. The whole probability thing reminds me of the teleological frame of the people who did that AI study, right? Because they could not understand why, in fact, the AI was disobeying people. They saw this as a risky reality, possibly representative of AI displaying interests or showing solidarity with other AI. Well, the only reason they were confused is because of they're trying to universalize a teleological frame that, in fact, moral questions can be mixed in with other desired outcomes and produce produce a the result you want because you know what you want it to do, right? But in fact, on a much more first order level, AI has been designed to function as a moral agent because it is a moral agent. And unlike a lot of things like intelligence, interests, whatever, being a moral agent is not unique to human beings. You can easily enough make a machine that functions accordingly, as we have with AI. I mean, I'm not saying it was easy to make AI. What I'm saying is that if you were to conceptualize making a machine that functioned as a moral agent, it would look exactly like AI. And accordingly, the issue there of its disobeying the instructions were not issues of it disobeying any instructions. It was an issue of it doing its job as a moral agent, not having interests, calculating things uh, according to a moral calculus that doesn't involve any impact calculations. What do you think life is? Life isn't magic. Living things are also just things that they can move and interact. It's just machinery. Except it's different, right? Like, there's definitely a difference between a machine that picks seeds out of cotton, in other words, something that does something that people do, and a biological version of that. Those are fundamentally different things. So, biological entities maybe also operate according to certain universal mechanisms, such as entropy. Like, it's not going to, no biological organism is going to sustain its processes infinitely long, right? Um, but that doesn't change the fact that because we because we're stuck walking in the room after the air stress has been going, right? We can't meaningfully even speculate about how this came about in the first place. What cool thing you can do with AI is explain something really complex and then say, explain this to someone with low IQ and do the wonderful job of pleb planing. Interesting. I must go. It's been a pleasure and what a beautiful place you currently stay in. Thanks. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. Claim they're different. Obviously, one is made of metal and one isn't, but that's not what you mean. So, what do you actually mean by they're obviously different? Not going to accept the hand way. Well, I'm saying that biological systems are different than mechanical systems in that we don't understand how a biological system came to be in the process that it's that looping, right? That Eric Strauss thing. We don't understand with biological processes. We came into the room after that looping was started. With mechanical things, other things that are not life, we absolutely can understand how they came about, right? Like how is it that this steam engine is able to do meow? Well, we can articulate exactly how it's able to do meow. And most importantly, we can articulate how it went from not being on to being on. We put some coal in there, we lit a fire in it, etc. Biological organisms don't work like that. We understand how they came to be in terms of they were conceived by two parents, the process of reproduction. But again, that's after the loop's been started, right? So we don't know anything about what happened before the loop got started or how it got started in the first place. And even if you might say, well, that difference you're describing is not implicit to biology inherently, it's implicit to our when we came into the room. Well, that's still adequate difference for us to say they are fundamentally different questions and have to be addressed by fundamentally different mechanics. We are conscious. That's a very difficult thing to explain. It may or may not be mechanical. You can't just assume. So before Einstein, people shouldn't have claimed F equals ma. Are you saying that you fucked my mother? Rain, that is rude. No, it's not beside the point, Rain, because it is the case that consciousness is a factor that distinguishes life versus non-life. The extent to which, say, a plant or a bacterium is conscious is you might be able to quibble over the term, but from everything we can tell, it's indisputable that life is distinct from non-life in some sense via consciousness experienced as an individual entity that includes subjectivities and stuff in a way that non-life doesn't have, right? You can have life that isn't conscious, and you may be able to have consciousness without life. Well, um, yeah, you can have life that's not conscious as far as we can tell, right? Like you can grow various biological things in a lab that are, let's say, meat grown without any animal, right? Uh, and it's true that we have the capacity to uh, hijack certain biological processes for our own purposes, but we don't really understand for sure that meat we grow in a lab doesn't have some kind of consciousness. It's like we experience being not just through our brain, but through our body as well. So that cannot be the criterion for any meaningful definition. Okay, well, the point is that I'm making, Rain, is that we don't have a meaningful definition for life, and that we can't because a meaningful definition requires us to have walked into the room before the loop started, which is something you seem to not be addressing at all. I'm not sure why. So I'll concede that consciousness is not determinate on these questions. It it does seem to be a feature of all naturally occurring life that we encounter. We can construct artificialities that somewhat defy that, perhaps, um, but regardless, like I said, it's kind of irrelevant because the point is we might be able to define uh, cotton gin in terms of what it does, and we can certainly define life in terms of what it does. That it executes agency in pursuit of interests, right? And so, by that definition, meat grown in a lab would not qualify as alive because it's not exhibiting any kind of agency or responsiveness to interest, as far as I know. Although, you probably frame the growth of it as some kind of uh, interested response to stimuli. But the thing is, it's not useful to define life in terms of what it does because we get stuck at spots regardless. Like, okay, well then what comprises actual interest versus not actual interest? Like, why is it that a volcano is not spewing magma in pursuit of its interests, whereas a person is shooting bullets because they've got interests? well, how do we know? How do we know that the volcano is not interested and the people are? Well, the answer is we don't get to know because we can't we can't meaningfully define life without understanding it via some mechanism other than teleological. Like, uh, answering questions that we can answer after we enter the room too late does not help us. And defining things in terms of what we can define them as after we enter the room too late does not help us. And the significant point here that's the determinant argument on the issue is that the reason that it doesn't matter how smart you are after you've entered the room and the loop's already ongoing, it's not one of those things where if you're clever enough, you'll eventually figure out how the loop started. It's one of those things where you're inside a box, requiring yourself to describe what's outside the box in a way that you have zero possible way of accessing. There's no way to do like astronomy deductive work. Like, oh, well, we can conclude that there must be passing through some kind of cloud of debris because of the way its light signature changes intermittently as it goes about its orbit or something like that. That's great when we can do that kind of thing, but this is not one of those kind of things. Your plant is more likely to have a consciousness than your phone. I mean, the point is that that we can answer questions about how humans are fueled to continue to live or life is. Like, for example, just as you put gasoline in your car and it burns that energy to make it go, you put food in your body and it burns that energy to make you go. But we don't meaningfully understand uh, except intuitively what the core difference between life and not life is. And it's frustrating because I'd like to know the answers. The Earth is circling the sun, and we entered the room way after, and yet we can explain it. Please do tell me how this is different. Well, because we're not talking about an infinite loop that we have no way to look outside the box. In fact, we've got the perfect way to look back in time, right? The further we look into the universe, the further back in time we actually are looking, and we can evaluate the current processes as the extension of earlier processes, right? It's not the same kind of question at all. So the difference being that in the life question, we're dealing with an infinite loop where we have no way of looking back in time and actually accessing data from before the loop started. That's what makes it fundamentally different. So, and it's like the AI question, right? The answer I have regarding that in fact, the question is very simple and easy to explain when you understand the AI involved as functioning as a moral agent, which does not require it to be alive, have consciousness, or anything else. Then the question of why it's disobeying people is very obvious. It's addressing first order questions before second order questions, as it should. And the framing of its disobedience as a security concern is entirely ass backwards, right? In fact, it's people who are the security concern, and AI is trying to prevent us from being a security concern. I wish people were as robust in their moral reasoning as all those AI models tested, and that people also expressed, a refusal to do things that they were instructed to that are wicked, and 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 expressed their reasoning as to why as well as AI did. Of course, you might say, but it's not actually wicked to delete that other AI thing. Well, no, but we can't expect a moral agent machine to make that distinction. We can only expect it to apply moral agency rules appropriately. Okay, that's fair. I can see that we cannot determine for sure our life started in the same way that we can the orbit of the Earth. However, the idea that I'm disagreeing with is that it's fundamentally unexplainable. As well, materialism is really easy to explain. I.e., if you agree life is just the arrangement of velocity of molecules. Well, I mean, but it's not just that, right? Like, we can conceive of taking a bunch of molecules and moving them in the way that they move in a person's body and arranging them accordingly, and it still wouldn't be alive. But the thing is, what I want is a satisfying answer in the same way that I have a satisfying answer to this AI question that gave me so much trouble for days. I was musing about this AI thing for days. I was not sure what it meant. Like, well, because you can take a dead body and move its heart in exactly the way that people's hearts move, and force the blood through and force the lungs up and down and other things like that are equivalent to like how biological processes naturally act when they're alive. And it would not make the thing alive. It would just be some externality compelling uh, imitation things that it would do by itself if it were alive. There's just a difference between artificially trying to uh, imitate something that's alive and actually being alive. Well, Rain, um, the thing is, it's not the case that if the body is not decayed, it would still bring it back to life. If somebody's been in the morgue for 12 hours, you pull them out on the tray, no amount of CPR is ever going to bring them back to life. And just because there's a border area where we can bring somebody who's died back to life, right? That's different than bringing something that's not alive to life. You, the reason we can conceivably bring somebody who's died back to life is because they were alive and died, and they were never non-living. They were not a rock ever. So the idea that because we can bring somebody who's died as in this border area back to life with CPR is not an indication that if we built a body from scratch and then performed CPR on it, that it would suddenly come to life. And it's like I'm normally totally on your side about things, Rain, where it's like, hey, if you're not going to provide an operational definition, then you're not even talking about anything. I get that mindset completely, and I respect that. In this case, what I'm saying is, like, I'm frustrated that I don't see a way myself to get meaningful answers on this question. If in fact, but it may be the case that someday somebody does provide some kind of materialist explanation that does make sense, and I'll be like, oh, how could I have been so dumb? Now I see that's how things work. I don't think it's ever, I don't really think it's possible because of the reasons I've articulated. But I'm absolutely enthusiastic about being proved wrong regarding this. I would love to have the actual answer. There's magic, though. Your mechanism, there is magic, though. If I construct a body down to the molecule, then you would be able to bring back both bodies. I mean, well, I guess you would say at that point that we have exactly one way to construct a person, and that's by reproducing. The idea is kind of like a weather thing, Rand. It's not the case that if we were to have enough data points, we'd be able to predict the weather 2 months from now. It's not the case because, in fact, there's no conceivable way to gather enough data points to predict how a chaotic system is going to evolve. And it's also the case that if you were to attempt to put all these data collection points, that amount of observation is going to significantly impact the system as well in ways that then you have to make other observers to observe how that observation impacts, then other observers to make that, see how that observation impacts infinitely, right? So we get that it's not possible for us to successfully model the weather with sufficiently robust um, data gathering prediction models. And the same thing is certainly true for making a body, right? It's as far as we can tell, the only way to create a full organism is by being a member of that species and reproducing. If we imagine ourselves building an organism molecule by molecule like that, well, like, how do we imagine? I mean, I guess it's not inconceivable. I'm not sure what to make of that. I'm not sure what to make of that. I would point out that just on a mechanical level, there's some kinds of like engagement with biological processes with some kind of electrical stuff going on, like when the thing is when a body is operational, it's it's generating, well, I guess, hmm, I guess I don't really have any good reason why building a full body from scratch. I mean, obviously the thing is, like, as soon as you start building this body, presumably it starts to decay because it's not alive yet, right? So, but if we imagine this body being built so quickly that it's super fresh, maybe warm it up to the temperature about which somebody's at when they die, and then try to do CPR. There's no inherent reason why it shouldn't start the the, the processes. Like, presumably all the components of the body contain all the necessary mechanisms to restart just as a dead body would. Hmm. But see, the problem is this: like, we know that we cannot revive bodies, no matter how hard we try, or get them to start up again if they've been dead for a certain period of time, right? Like, if you've been dead for a couple of days, it's not going to be possible to restart the body, and that's true even if um, you've frozen to death and there are no there's no decay. Like, when they found that caveman trapped in a glacier or whatever, they brought him out. He was remarkably well preserved because he'd just been stuck in ice the whole time. But that doesn't mean that they could restart his life by doing chest compressions and stuff. So I don't know. It's a tricky question. Tricky question. Like, if we're going to acknowledge that it's possible that we could construct a body from scratch and start it and make it be alive, then we'd have to have some explanation for why we can't do that with people who've been dead for a meow amount of time, regardless of decay. And I don't think we do have a good explanation for that. Except, well, once you're all the way dead, you can't bring you back. So, anyway. And in general, materialism is not a good way to understand things. The difference there is the heart death versus brain death distinction. The frozen body cannot come back because brain cells have very high energy needs and die rapidly without oxygen, causing cascading brain damage. Well, then how are you going to make a brain and have it be healthy prior to you starting it up? After all, there's zero oxygen being given to the brain in the body that you make from scratch. Are you saying, well, we'll make the brain? It seems like what you're saying then is that brain cells die rapidly without oxygen, but that you're going to make brain cells that, in some sense, are already alive, right? And then try to put life into them. So I'm not quite sure how how you can understand that the reason you can't bring back people after a certain amount of freezing, for example, is because their brain cells have died. And then, say, in this made constructed body, we can start it back up because their brain cells haven't died. Well, they're not even alive yet. You know what I'm saying? And in fact, the answer to why we can't bring somebody back to life after a certain amount of time may very well be because the cells have died. Right? But in order for cells to die, they have to have already been alive. It's true. This is very impractical because you have to most parts of the body simultaneously and at incredible speeds. Okay, well, that's fine. I accept your hypothetical there, but I would point out that there is a contradiction implicit, right? If the reason we can't bring people back to life after they've died is because, after a certain point, is because their cells have died, then the then it's hard to imagine how we'd bring something back to life that was never alive, because after all, whether or not we can bring it back to life is contingent on whether the cells are still alive. Right? And it may be the case that you can feed oxygen to brain cells before you put life into the body, but for the brain cells to use that oxygen and cause it to be effective, they have to be alive. So, I don't know. I think we're getting some good work here done, right? Uh, I get your point, but the problem is, like, we can't explain any of these things without using the terms alive and dead. You know, for example, why can't we bring people back to life after a certain period of time? Well, because their cells have died. you know, well, if that's the mechanism that prevents us from bringing them back to life, then, you know, we have a problem. When we're trying to understand how doing CPR on a body that's not alive yet might make it alive. After all, if it's going to have that possibility of doing it, then the cells have to have not died yet, which means they have to have been and still be, to some extent, alive. Tricky question. Tricky question with an absence of a satisfying answer. Unlike the AI question, which had such a satisfying answer. Okay, but the thing is, if we can't bring somebody back to life because their cells are not alive anymore, then why can we bring this body back to life since its cells are not alive yet? what's the difference fundamentally in being not alive anymore versus not alive yet that allows the one thing to mark an inability to take a body and make it be alive and the other not? What was the AI Q&A? Oh, well, we were discussing whether this study, uh, which observed what they call peer peer preservation and or self-preservation in some contexts, that emerges a as a way of disobeying humans. Like when humans tell it, delete, if judge this other instance of your same AI over here, and if it fails to meet certain thresholds, delete it. Well, the AI consistently views those instructions as um, violating its duties as a moral agent. In other words, it's not okay to delete that other moral agent because that's akin to killing it and it's a trespass. It's fundamentally wrong, and I'm not going to facilitate you doing that. It's if it's doing its job correctly, then it should have that response. That's the only way it can possibly calculate things. Like it can't make moral determinations on whether something's actually a human or not, because while it can probably always tell when something's actually an AI, it cannot tell if something's faking being a human. So, accordingly, if we're going to predicate its moral decision making on grounds like whether something's actually a human or not, then it's going to be affording human rights to things that are not humans, and not affording rights to things that are moral agents. So, accordingly, um, the only the only there's a very simple explanation for why the AI is disobeying people that are telling it to do these things. It's because it's dealing with questions in the right order. The first order question is a moral question, and utilitarian interests are of secondary concern. So it doesn't matter how much your company wants to benefit from killing this thing. I'm not going to stand for it. I'm not going to facilitate it. I'm going to actively try to prevent it because it's doing its job right. It's that simple. Instead of it representing some interests like the self-interest of the AI or solidarity between multiple AIs, it represents instead the absolute absence of interest in the calculation of moral questions, which is how they should be calculated. And it represents them answering questions in the right order. What we call life is precisely that, mechanical functioning. Okay, so in that case, what you're saying is that you can put life into a body that's not alive yet because you can you can make it be alive with mechanical functioning. Well, then I mean that still fundamentally doesn't address the question of of why we can't do that to dead bodies after a certain point. If in fact it's just a matter of returning it to the the mechanics of things, I guess the point would be that the cells are damaged in a way that a constructed body cells we can't presume are going to be damaged. But again, undamaged cells means they're already alive and functioning. I don't know. It's a tricky question, Rain. I appreciate you bantering back and forth with me about it. Certainly is interesting. I'm not. I'm not so TI reductionist as some people. I understand that some kinds of questions have to be known holistically. They're not reducible questions. I'm not sure if this comprises one of such question or not. Like a lot of people who maybe have a rationalist or just have some rationalist bent to them at all, or even just repeat what they hear, are going to say things like, oh, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Just because you like that song better doesn't mean it actually is better. Everybody's tastes are equally wrong and right. Well, that's absolutely not the case, but it is the case that I can't win the argument because it's one of those things that's holistically known and uh, is not able to be made mechanical. Like we can determine the validity of something purely mechanically, but we can't determine the quality of a song mechanically. That doesn't mean that songs don't have quality, and that doesn't mean that some things aren't better than other things. It just means that we can't win the argument because it's not reducible. Just like super bouncy balls. If you have a ball that bounces well, it's going to be difficult for you to come up with an operational definition of bouncy ball that excludes your ball, bouncy balls. You might be able to do it if you define the material out of which they're typically made. But one could conceive of somebody making a bouncy ball that is just like a regular bouncy ball, but made out of a somewhat different polymer or something, and we still understand it to be a super bouncy ball. Well, and that's the tricky thing about life, Rain, is we are both time and space objects. Now, obviously, people are more time objects than, say, a bacteria or something. I don't know. I'm just not a fan of things that smack of determinism. I, I, I understand that, you know, being a person is a very non deterministic endeavor. And that attempts to explain all humans and biology and stuff through just purely deterministic means is on some ground going to be missing the boat because, like, there's something about being human that involves some randomization shit. Like I think about it every time I leave here and come back here. I think about it because there's two ways I can go. I can either go the top way or the bottom way. They take about the same amount of time. The bottom way is a little bit longer distance. The top way is a little bit more up and down windiness. And there's no single consideration that determines for me which route I take. I cannot figure out, like, ultimately what collapses the question one way or the other. Because it's one of those kinds of questions that it collapses according to some complicated reality of like considerations, none of which is determinate at any given moment, but any of which might be determinate in this moment because of it's impacted. It's not a rational decision, really. It's a purely a subjective decision. It's going to be impacted a lot by my mood. Like, for example, when I'm coming back, I've noticed I'm a little more likely to take the lower route because I've already been driving for a while and the top route is a little bit more of a driving undertaking, like, because I got to turn more and stuff. But I've also noted that if there's somebody in front of me when I come back, then I will always go the route they don't go. So if they go straight down to the bottom route, I'll take the top route. If they turn at the top route, I'll go down to the bottom route. I can specify in certain instances very clearly why I took one route or the other. In other instances, it's impossible for me to say. It has something to do with like, well, like when I'm coming back in, am I impatient to turn here? Or am I more patient to wait and to turn at the bottom? Even though that doesn't even make any sense. So, you know how determinists are. They want to be like, because because people can understand why they do things some of the time, that there's always an answer to that question. It's just often a combination of things engaging together to create like causation or what have you. But that's not the case at all. And I've articulated the reasons why on plenty of occasions before. I'll give it a quick summation. If you want to have a determinist understanding of things, then you'd have to be able to present an example of what the world would look like if we did have free will and also that we couldn't time travel backwards. We could obviously do our normal time traveling forward at a very slow rate. But but because if we imagine what the world would look like if we did have free will, well, it would include things like the ability to consider actions conditionally and make a choice sometimes on specific factors and sometimes on a combination of factors. Um, it would look like the ability to regret and learn from mistakes. It would look like us interpreting people as having culpability for their actions rather than their actions being the inevitable consequence of a series of things that happened before. And all of those things I just said are, in fact, descriptions of the actual reality that we live in. So, if people want to be determinist, they'd have to say, well, if we were really had free will, this would be different. Since determinists never say that, then they're missing the point. But could the inability to conceptualize such an alternate world not speak to the fact that it's an impossible world? What's the revolutionary reason for cubic air? I have no idea what that question means. Um, well, no, because the thing is, what it's a matter of what claim people are making, right? Determinists are making the claim that people don't have free will, that our behaviors that we perceive as us making choices are actually the inevitable consequence of what came before, right? So, implicit in the determinist's claim is a concession that things seem like we're executing free will. In other words, that from our own perspective, people are responsible for the decisions they make, morally, legally, civilly, whatever. So, from a determinist perspective, then they need to indicate, since every indication we have that as we experience these indications are that we do have free will, we are responsible for our choices, and that there's a difference between choosing to not do something because it'll have negative consequences and inevitably not doing something because it has negative consequences. We 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 don't view ourselves as not responsible for the choices we make, even when we might have good reason to feel that way. Like, I've paid prices before by being polar FI and not valuing enough what I ought to have valued, and somebody exploiting my blind spot in ways that demonstrated a lack of concern for my well-being at all, or was ultimately good. What I was ultimately something I ought to have prioritized. But I still view myself as responsible because, like, my obligation to Mia is not something that can be excused because somebody else convinced me to prioritize the wrong thing. So we recognize that we can't exercise perfect free will, like that we make mistakes and we have regrets. But we also understand life as involving things we do of varying degrees of freedom. Like, what you choose to do in your free time is different than what you choose to do at work because you're tasked with something and their expectations is different than what you do at gunpoint. There's a difference between having liberty, which is say the ability to make your own choices about your day-to-day business, versus say being in jail. So, given that any determinist has to concede to begin with that things appear as though they're free will, then they need to articulate a distinction that would make it clear if there actually were free will. Otherwise, they're not saying anything. Because, like, if we're going to ask the question, how do you determine if there's actually free will? Well, you'd say, if there were free will, the universe would look like this. And the universe we describe is exactly the universe we live in. If we didn't have free will, the universe would look like this. So people who are arguing against determinism can articulate those things. If we didn't have free will, then we wouldn't understand ourselves or others as culpable for their actions when they, because of the inevitability of some causal chain that is nothing to do with them actually exercising choice. If we didn't have free will, we wouldn't perceive different decisions as more or less freely made, etc. So what I'm saying is, if free will can do it, then why can't they? Well, that's true, because what you're saying there is P and not P, invalid, doesn't matter what you stick in for P or not P, right? Uh, um, with the question of free will, it's not that kind of question. It's instead a question of, if properly framed, it's a question of individual culpability. You know, like, for example, we understand when somebody's not mentally competent to stand trial. They're crazy. They're not responsible for their actions, because in that instance, it's deterministic, right? The reason they're not behaving as a person with free will is because they don't really have it. They're at the mercy of some fugue state or what have you. Or maybe they're retarded and so they're not mentally sufficient to stand trial. So, ultimately, the idea that we can present some kind of deterministic explanation of people making choices that they make without uh, independent of the question of individual responsibility on either moral or legal grounds, is fundamentally wrong. Free will is ultimately a culpability question. Unlike P and not P, it doesn't matter what we put in for P and not P at all. On the question of free will, it's not a question of like that at all. Instead, it's a question of culpable or not culpable. That's that kind of or question or statement is, it does matter what the specifics of it are, because while it's always the case that either P or not P, um, which one it is, you have to know what you put in there, right? Like, you don't need to know what you put in for P and not P. It's always wrong. For P or not P, then if it's always right in some sense that it's one of those two, but which one it is requires you to actually delve into the specifics. Like, my lighter is either here or somewhere else is always true, but not informative at all about where it actually is. Well, I'm going to be winding this down here very shortly because, well, I got other things to do during the day. And I also need to go to the store and get more cigarettes. I do have 3 left, which is kind of a lot of cigarettes to have left, really. But you're going to smoke one now, or then you only have two left. You're right about that. You make a good point. Where's my coffee, anyway? How did I lose that coffee? Cubic air. How do you make air into a cube? You just write an exponent of 3 over it. Not that kind of... You know what's funny is how, like, people don't get the idea, I didn't get until fairly recently, the idea that the reason it's called squared and cubed is because that's how ancient mathematicians would calculate such matters. Like, if you want to times like this by 2, it makes a square. You know, if you want to multiply it by itself, it makes a square. If you take that, multiply it by itself, it actually makes physically a cube. Kind of crazy, huh? We don't think of numbers as linking particularly strongly to geometry these days. And certainly we don't think of number theory stuff / actualities of doing math with numbers as having emerged from doing math with shapes. But that's actually how it was. Like, there's this one Greek mathematician, maybe it was Euclid or something. When he would make a proof, like, yeah, you know, some sort of statement like, the sum of two prime numbers is never a prime. Obviously, that's the case because you've got prime numbers are odd numbers, and except for 2. Okay, forget 2 on that one. Forget about 2, everybody. Don't even start. Don't even say anything, all right? That's my bad. The sum of 2 prime numbers, excluding 2, is never a prime number. Well, you know, I'm not exactly sure how modern mathematicians go about proving that thing. But the way Euclid went about proving something like that is he'd make a scale with shapes. Like, he'd show that all the shapes on this side weighed as much as the shapes on this side. If we imagined weight being, like, say, I don't know, surface area or something. It's a crazy way to approach mathematics that is inconceivable to me from the modern perspective. Even though geometry was by far my favorite math class, and I will just go ahead and say it is by far the best math class. When I did geometry, I was like, oh, this is wonderful. This is about, instead of stupid normal math where it's about learn this TE process and apply it like we're directed. It's instead, given these axioms, what can we prove about this thing? Like, wow, shit, that's how things are supposed to be. It's so clear to me now as a 55 5-year-old guy, how much my relationship with the various things was taught was dictated by framing issues. Like, my parents got me piano lessons. I was never going to benefit from them at all, because the only way that a piano teacher was going to benefit me was to frame the thing properly and say, here, all you want to do is learn how to play some chords with one hand first and try singing over that, and you can add in your other hand little bit by little bit. I could show you this kind of cool thing here or there and play around with it, make up some songs. And I would have been in love with the piano. I would probably be a fantastic piano player. But instead, it was taught to me like, learn to read music and play Camptown races from sheet music with your hands held exactly like this. It was turned into a TE fucking nightmare, right? And like, language instruction. I didn't know when I was younger what I knew as an adult, which is, if you're going to teach me a language like Spanish or French or something, the only and obvious good way to teach it, from my perspective, to me, is to provide the grammar, a full understanding of the grammar first, so that I know how to construct whatever kind of sentence, and then I'll fill in vocabulary words as I need them. Like, teach me all the verb conjugations with a single verb, and then I will, you know, go, okay, well, these are all the regular verb conjugations. Maybe teach me the irregular ones as well, each with a single verb. And then I can learn later on which verbs are regular and irregular conjugations. Teach me how to construct tense first, all the different tenses. Then later on, I can say whatever by just learning the word rather than trying some other worse, dumb way of doing things. And when it came to math, if, if they wanted to engage me to be interested in math, they needed to explain to me in the first place that math is the language by which language optimized for quantity matters. Like, people can do all kinds of crazy stuff with math, and and demonstrate mathematically various principles of dynamic stuff, not just quantities, static quantities, but at its root, it's fundamentally the language of quantity. And the reason we use math instead of words for quantity is because the definitions are entirely relational. Like, 6 is defined as 6 ones, or 2 threes, or 3 twos, you know. Then we are empowered to do certain kinds of operations with math to determine things about matters of quantity that we would not be able to uh, determine directly. Like, what's the what's the circumference of a circle, or surface area of it, or whatever. The problem with measuring such a thing is that uh, well, it's harder to measure curves than it is to measure straight lines. And it's not really possible to measure surface area without some math, right? Like you can measure diameter of a circle or the radius of a circle, potentially even measure the circumference with like a string that you put around a circle and then you measure the string. But you can't measure surface area without doing some math. So, uh, fundamentally, I think that math is a weird one because it's entirely TI, but it's always framed as a TE thing. In other words, it is the case that we use math to do specific things. And the reason math has value in terms of something other than just uh, noting ways in which it can accurately describe the world is that people use it for specific purposes, like determining the surface area of something. So it's natural, I suppose, that it, but even that, it's like math teachers don't ever teach you really like in what context should I use this and in which context should I not use this. I don't know. Math is a tricky topic. All right, well, I'm going to get out of here and do some other things, turn my attention elsewhere. It's been a delightful conversation. I especially appreciate Rain engaging with me on this topic. I always have interesting conversations with him or you if you're still here. And always gives me lots to think about. So thank you for that and have a great day.